Hey Greysteel Nation, Sully here with the Barbell Prescription, keeping you strong and healthy in your 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. Thanks for subscribing. The overhead press is not the heaviest movement, but it is arguably the most technically demanding of the big four. It's worth the effort to learn how to press, however, especially for the athlete of aging, because strong shoulders are a blessing at any age, and an uncommon blessing after 40 or 50. The overhead press muscles are especially prone to atrophy and loss of mobility in aging, and training the overhead press puts the brakes on that degeneration. The overhead press is graceful, balanced, beautiful, and powerful. And that means when you do a great overhead press, you are graceful, balanced, beautiful, and powerful. It's the best shoulder exercise there is, hands down. But again, it's a technically demanding movement because it has the longest kinetic chain of any of the exercise we train. The overhead press is as prone to form errors as any other exercise, and less forgiving. Being aware of these errors and fixing them is the best approach to improving your overhead press form. So let's talk about 5 of the most common overhead press errors we see. All of them are easily fixed. And I'll tell you right now, the last one is a killer. Error number 1, overhead press grip width. Sometimes you'll see people go too narrow on the press, but the more common error is to go too wide. The press works best when the forearms are vertical in every plane and the elbow joints are under the bar. If you take a grip that's too wide, like bench press wide, you're creating unnecessary leverage of the bar against the elbow that doesn't help you get the weight up. Take a grip that allows you to hold the bar with vertical forearms, close to the shoulder joint, with wrists straight. And that brings us to error number 2, wrists extended. When you're under the overhead press or the bench press, there are no wrists. We would prefer that the wrists not be a part of the kinetic chain of the exercise. If you were an overhead pressing robot, a press terminator, we would make you without wrists because you don't need them. Now, wrist flexion is not a common form error because it feels weird and actively sucks, but wrist overextension is all too common. This introduces a power leak into the movement and a theoretical risk of injury, although in my experience, wrist tweaks in the press are extremely rare. But an extended wrist is inefficient, and it's so easy to fix. When you take your grip on the bar, deviate your wrists inward so that your fingers are pointing at each other, and the bar is pressed hard into the heel of the palm in an oblique configuration, on top of the thenar eminence of the thumb and crossing over the hypothenar eminence, the fleshy part of the palm beneath the little finger, basically with the bar along your lifeline. Then complete your grip by putting your fingerprints into the metal of the bar with a death grip. The part of your hand extending from the calluses at the base of your fingers to the last joint of your fingers is forbidden to the metal. Don't press that part of your hand against the bar. Instead, there should be a sort of tunnel between the bar and the fingers. When you hold the bar seated in the heel of the palm with the fingerprints digging into the metal and the wrists slightly deviated in this way, the wrists can be held in extension and the press will be more efficient and more comfortable. Error number 3, jelly belly and weak knees. In our version of the press, we incorporate a body movement. In this movement, the hips are thrust forward against tight abs and tight quads with straight knees. The tightness in the belly and knees are critical. It's an error to think of the press as a strictly upper body movement. No matter how strong your arms and shoulders, you can't hoist a heavy bar overhead into a stable position on a column of jelly. Weak belly and weak knees are a power leak, and they also contribute to a related form error. That's right, a bonus form error, which is a failure to complete the lockout. The lockout is performed with a hard shrug that rotates the scapulae and prevents the shoulder joint from impinging, as we discussed in our video on the press prescription. But again, a hard shrug on a wobbly torso and legs gets you nowhere. You have to lean your upper body forward to get under the bar. Or, thought of another way, you have to get your hips back. Either way, a strong press lockout will result in tight quads, a tight butt, and tight abs. This is not the top of the press. It's not stable, it won't support the weight you're truly capable of lifting, and it looks dorky. This is the top of the press, with every muscle locked into strong isometric contraction to provide a rigid column of strength to support the shoulders and the bar. Please notice, though, that this position does not involve cervical flexion. Getting your shoulders under the bar is not activated by cranking your neck and burying your chin in your chest. Which brings us to error number 4, all up in your face. I see this all the time. People perform a pretty good body movement and launch the bar well, but they actively put their face in the way of the bar. If you just keep your cervical spine in neutral, always a good idea in barbell training, the hip thrust will move your face out of the way. Yes, as Rippetoe emphasizes, it is important to keep your gaze forward and not look up. But this can be done through the beauty of the oculomotor muscles, which allow you to look at something even when the orientation of your head changes. But all too often, it seems that people think their gaze position forward requires them to keep their head oriented in the same position. And so they actively flex their neck in the hip thrust. Or they think that flexing their neck gives them a head start getting under the bar. Either way, it pushes their face into the bar path, and the bar will then travel around your face, because your brain understands, even if you don't, that your face and your bar cannot occupy the same space at the same time. A similar error is what I call the chin hook. Here, the lifter actively hooks his chin over the bar at the setup. If he doesn't get his chin out of the way, the bar has to unlatch, which creates a bar path error. If he's performing press 2.0, his chin will be out of the way on the hip thrust, unless, again, he flexes his neck, in which case bar path hijinks will ensue. The moral of the story? At the press setup, the bar needs to be close to the shoulders, but there's no need for it to be aggressively latched under the chin. If your anthropometry and a correct grip conspire to put the bar under your chin at setup, well, first check your grip and make sure it's actually correct. Otherwise, make sure you get your chin out of the way and don't flex your neck on the hip thrust. The press is hard enough without you putting your face in its way. Error number 5, dropping your elbows either during your setup or after the hip thrust. There is something about the press with a body movement that invites the terrible misapprehension that the hip thrust is accompanied by an active drop of the bar and the elbows. Now, it is true that if you thrust your hips forward, you become effectively shorter, and there will be a corresponding slight dip of the bar because of your virtual loss of height. But I believe this is correctly a passive phenomenon, not an active one. The vertical orientation of the forearms should not change. But what happens all too often is that the lifter aggressively plunges his elbows downward and back as he thrusts his hip forward. This is wickedness and perversion, and it bears all manner of poisonous fruit. For one thing, it changes the angle of the forearm, technically the radius, making it less vertical, and will almost always result in the elbows being behind the bar. In this unclean configuration, the radius is poised to transmit force to the bar along an outward vector, away from the shoulder. This will not end well. But it gets worse. Instead of allowing the hip thrust to drive the shoulders forward under the bar, minimizing the undesirable moment between the bar and the shoulder joint, the elbow drop pulls the bar away from the shoulder. Not to mention that it pulls the bar down, which, as you may be aware, is the opposite of the direction we want it to go. At lighter weights, this results in an uglier, less efficient, less technically correct, and heavier press. At higher weights, it results in a gross misgroove and a miss. So, don't drop the bar on the hip thrust. Instead, Focus on keeping the upper back and shoulders tight, squeezing the armpits shut, and keeping the forearms vertical. Shove your hips forward and let them drive the shoulders accordingly, under the bar. The bar moves only after the hip thrust, when it launches straight up from its position as close to directly over the shoulder joints as you can make it. If you correct these errors and don't commit any of these sins under a heavy press, it will still be hard, of course. It's supposed to be hard, but it's not supposed to be harder than it's supposed to be. Keep watching. Coming right up, we've got great videos for you about the press and other strength training exercises that will keep you, your metabolism, your muscles, and your skeleton young and healthy, as detailed in our book, The Barbell Prescription.